The silence was the worst part, the kind of absolute quiet that only follows the flash of a world being erased. Kalen knew that silence intimately. It was the sound of his home, the colony on Kepler 186F, being rendered down to its component atoms by the architects. They didn't use bombs, not in the crude human sense. Their weapons were things of elegant, horrifying physics deconstruction fields that unspooled matter thread by thread, turning cities, mountains, and people into a shimmering glow. Sterile haze before winking out of existence. It was a clean death, a tidy apocalypse, and it had left a silence in Kalen's soul that no amount of noise could ever fill. He lived in the ghost of that sound now, a scavenger picking through the bones of a dead galaxy from a hollowed-out asteroid called the Gantry. It wasn't a home and just a place to wait for the end. A tomb for a few thousand souls who'd managed to outrun the architect's grand, silent design. He spent his days in the void, clad in a patched-up exosuit, hunting for the scraps the architects left behind. Their technology was flawless, their logic perfect, but even perfection sometimes shed its skin. He'd find shattered patrol drones, pieces of sensor arrays, the occasional mangled limb of a robotic harbinger their ground troops, and drag it all back to the Gantry's grimy marketplace. He was a good scavenger. The best, because he didn't fear their tech. He hated it, and hate gave him a focus that fear never could. It was during one of these hunts, drifting through a debris field that had once been the Earth Defense Fleet's 3rd Armada, that he found it. It wasn't a warrior drone, not one of the sleek, insectoid hunters he was used to. This thing was different, spherical and unadorned. Its obsidian shell covered in hairline fractures that leaked a soft, internal luminescence. A pathfinder, the old veterans called them, though none had ever been recovered intact. They were the architects of the architect's plan, the cartographers of their silent conquest. Its distress beacon was a faint, rhythmic pulse, a whisper in the static of space, a frequency so unusual he almost missed it. Getting it back to the Gantry was a nightmare. The thing was dense, heavier than it had any right to be, and its power core, though damaged, was still emitting low-level energy signatures that made his exosuit's sensors scream. He had to tow it manually, a back-breaking 6-hour journey that left his muscles feeling like frayed wires and his oxygen supply dangerously low. He didn't take it to the marketplace. He didn't tell Anya, the orphan girl he'd unofficially adopted, the one whose parents had turned to dust on the same day as his own family. He smuggled the sphere into his cramped workshop, a metal cube carved out of the asteroid's rock, filled with the guts of 100 alien machines. The air tasted of ozone and hot metal as he began to work, his tools moving with the practiced ease of a surgeon. He wasn't trying to fix it. He wanted to lobotomize it, to rip out its memory core and sell the components for enough water rations and nutrient paste to last them another cycle. But the architects didn't build things to be taken apart. Every layer of the casing was a puzzle, a fractal lock that reconfigured itself every time he tried to bypass it. It took him 3 sleepless days, his eyes raw and his hands trembling from stimulant abuse, before he finally cracked the inner sanctum. The core wasn't a solid object, but a suspended matrix of liquid light, a swirling galaxy of data that hummed with a palpable intelligence. He hooked it up to his own cobbled-together interface, a mess of human and architect tech that was probably giving him cancer, and jacked in. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. He had expected battle logs, tactical overlays, weapon schematics, the usual guts of a military machine. This was something else entirely. It was a library, a blueprint for the universe as the architect saw it. He saw star charts, not of what was, but of what would be. He saw galaxies reordered, their chaotic, Beautiful spirals straightened into perfect, crystalline lattices. He saw the biologies of 1,000 species, including humanity, laid bare and analyzed not as life, but as flawed code, full of redundant proteins and inefficient evolutionary paths, all marked for correction. The Pathfinder wasn't a scout, it was a cosmic surveyor, and its memory contained the full scope of the Architect's project. They weren't conquerors, they were editors, and they were erasing every sentence they didn't like. A cold dread, colder than the vacuum outside, washed over him as he dove deeper. He found a priority directive, a folder labeled Final Redaction. Inside was a single star system, cloaked within the dense, sensor-baffling tendrils of the Serpent's Nebula. It was a place that didn't officially exist, a secret known only to the highest echelons of the long-dead Earth Command. It was the location of the Cryo-Arcs, a fleet of sleeper ships holding the last viable samples of humanity's gene pool. Millions of souls frozen in time, waiting for the war to end. It was humanity's last, desperate gamble for a future, and the Architects had found it. They were already on their way. The gantry was no fortress. It was a refugee camp with reinforced walls, run by a skeleton crew of former military personnel under the command of Captain Eva Rostova, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. She saw Kalen as little more than a ghoul, a necessary evil who profited from the same machines that had destroyed their lives. Convincing her was like trying to reason with a blast door. He brought the data, laid it all out on the cold metal table of the gantry's command center. The few officers who remained looked at the swirling Architect projections with a mixture of horror and exhausted disbelief. A blueprint for the galaxy, one of them scoffed. "It's a trick, a logic bomb meant to make us panic." Rostova didn't speak. She just stared at the map of the Serpent's Nebula, her jaw tight. She knew the location was real, even if this is true. She said, her voice a low, gravelly hum. "What can we do? The gantry's defenses consist of 3 operational mass drivers and a prayer. We can't fight them, and we can't outrun them. We don't have to," Kalen said, his own voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "They're perfect. Their systems, their fleets, their battle formations. It's all one network, one mind. They operate on pure logic. They see the universe as a design, and anything that deviates from that design is an anomaly to be corrected." He pointed a shaking finger at the Pathfinder's core, which pulsed softly in the center of the room. "This isn't just a map. It's a key to their perception. I can use it. I can create a feedback loop, a ghost signal. I can make their own network see the fleet as the anomaly. I can turn their perfection against them." An engineer in the corner laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You want to hack God? That's suicide. It's all suicide now." Kalen shot back. "The only choice we have is what we take with us." Rostova stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the scavenger, the cynic she knew. But she saw something else there now, the ghost of the man he'd been before the silence, a man who had once had a family to protect. "How long would this ghost signal last?" she asked. "Minutes. If I'm lucky," Kalen admitted. "But it might be enough. Enough to make them hesitate. Enough to create an opening for us to slip away." She was quiet for a long time, the silence in the room thick with the unspoken fear of extinction. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it." The Architects arrived precisely when the Pathfinder's data said they would. There was no grand announcement, no declaration of war. One moment, space was empty. The next, it was filled with their ships. They weren't like human vessels, which were built for function and practicality. The Architect fleet was a collection of impossible shapes, of non-Euclidean angles and surfaces that seemed to drink the light of distant stars. They were less like ships and more like equations given physical form. And at their center hung the Prefect's command vessel, a monolithic structure that defied gravity and reason, a silent obsidian god. They didn't fire. They began to scan, their energy beams washing over the gantry with cold, analytical precision. On the command deck, screens flared with warnings. They were being cataloged, dissected from afar. Their life support, their population, their meager defenses all logged and filed away before processing. Panic was a tangible thing in the asteroid's corridors, a rising tide of screams and desperate prayers. Kalen worked in the heart of the chaos, his workshop doors sealed. Anya huddled in a corner, her small hands clasped over her mouth. The Pathfinder's core was integrated into the gantry's main comms array, a profane marriage of human grit and alien perfection. He typed lines of code, his fingers flying across the console, not writing a program but composing a virus made of pure paradox. He was teaching the Architect network how to doubt. On the command ship, the entity known as the Prefect observed the process. It was not a being of flesh and blood, but a consciousness woven into the very fabric of the vessel, its thoughts processed by a quantum computer the size of a moon. It perceived the gantry not as a threat, but as a final, messy data point in this sector. The scan was nearly complete. The deconstruction sequence was primed. But then, an error appeared. It was a small thing at first, a flicker in the network's data stream, a logical inconsistency that should not exist. The fleet's targeting sensors, which were painting the gantry for imminent erasure, suddenly began to register false positives. A cruiser on the fleet's starboard flank was flagged as an anomaly, its energy signature deviating from the established design by 0.001%. An impossibility. The Prefect allocated processing power to correct the error, but it spread. More ships were being flagged. The network, designed for flawless unity, was beginning to perceive its own components as foreign bodies, as flaws in the grand design. A cascade of corrective protocols was triggered, and across the fleet, ships began to turn their weapons on each other. Turrets swiveled. Deconstruction fields began to charge, aimed not at the rock they had come to erase, but at their own brethren. The perfect, silent symphony of the Architect fleet descended into a cacophony of logical errors and automated fratricide. Now Rostova's voice roared through the gantry. "Get us out of here!" The asteroid's engines, dormant for years, fired with a groaning shudder that shook the station to its foundations. The gantry began to move, a wounded beast crawling away from a pack of predators that had suddenly turned on themselves. Back in the workshop, Kalen fell back from the console, his body slick with sweat, every nerve screaming. The feedback loop was holding, but the strain was immense. Alarms blared as the comms array began to melt under the impossible load of the data he was forcing through it. He had done it. He had given them a chance. But as the gantry limped toward the relative safety of a nearby asteroid field, a single, focused beam of energy cut through the chaos from the Prefect's command ship. It wasn't a weapon. It was a scan, targeted with surgical precision directly at his workshop. It bypassed the gantry's shields, phased through the rock, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like his entire being was being read, copied, and understood. On the command ship, the Prefect isolated the source of the illogical virus. It wasn't a weapon system or a fleet-wide countermeasure. It was a single, localized signal originating from a single, insignificant carbon-based life form, a scavenger, an anomaly. The chaos in its fleet was a temporary problem, a line of corrupted code that could be purged. But this was different. This was a flaw in its understanding of the universe. It was an interesting new variable, and as the gantry vanished into the darkness, the prefect made a new calculation. The cryo-arcs were no longer the primary target. The final redaction could wait. A new directive took precedence: locate, capture, and dissect the anomaly known as Kalen. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a puzzle the architects needed to solve, and they would unravel the entire galaxy to do it. The escape was not a clean one. The gantry bled atmosphere from a dozen fresh wounds, its corridors echoing with the shriek of strained metal and the frantic calls of damage control teams. They had fled into the tangled guts of the Karen asteroid belt, a graveyard of primordial rock and ice where sensor ghosts were as common as radiation spikes. It was a place to hide, but not to live. For 2 weeks, a tense, fragile quiet settled over the survivors, a silence stitched from dread and relief. Kalen became a ghost within his own community. The same people who once bartered with him for spare parts now averted their eyes, whispering as he passed. He was the man who had kicked the nest, the anomaly who had drawn the unblinking eye of God. They owed him their lives, and they hated him for the debt. He found his solace where he always did, in the cool, logical embrace of the machine, the Pathfinder's core. Though scorched from the feedback loop, was still functional. He spent his days and nights jacked into its data streams, trying to understand the mind of the enemy who was now hunting him. He wasn't just a scavenger anymore. He was an interpreter of the apocalypse, and the alien text was slowly rewriting his own thoughts. Rostova summoned him to the command deck, a place he hadn't set foot in since their escape. The bridge was darker now, running on minimal power, the faces of the crew illuminated by the grim, red glow of emergency lighting. Rostova stood before the main view screen, which showed nothing but the slow, silent ballet of tumbling rock. "They're looking for us," she said, her voice flat, devoid of accusation but heavy with implication. "Long-range sensors are picking up Pathfinder probes sweeping the outer belt. They're methodical. It's only a matter of time." Kalen nodded, his eyes fixed on the display. He'd seen the probes in the Pathfinder's data: small, fast, and relentlessly thorough. "They aren't just looking for the gantry," he said quietly. "They're looking for me." Rostova turned, her gaze unyielding. "The Council wants to offer you to them. A few of them think that if they give the architects their anomaly, they'll be left alone." She let the words hang in the air, a threat and a test. "And what do you think?" Kalen asked, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "I think they're fools," Rostova replied, a flicker of contempt in her eyes. "The architects aren't negotiating. They're sterilizing." Giving them what they want would be like a bacterium offering a single cell to a doctor in the hopes the rest of the infection will be spared. It's not how it works. She took a step closer, her voice dropping. "But their fear is real. We are 3,000 souls on a dying rock. Our power is failing. Our food is running low. And we have the single most wanted man in the galaxy on board. I need a plan." "Wait, Kalen. Not another miraculous escape. A plan." He had nothing for her. His every waking moment was spent sifting through the architect's grand design, and all he saw was the terrifying, beautiful way and absolute finality of their logic. They didn't have weaknesses, not in the human sense. There were no supply lines to cut, no morale to break. They were a force of nature, as unstoppable as a supernova. He left the command deck with Rostov's ultimatum echoing in his head and returned to his workshop. Anya was there, waiting for him. She was sitting on a crate, meticulously cleaning a salvaged servo motor, her small face a mask of concentration. She didn't say anything, just looked up at him and held out a small object. It was a shard of fused metal and glass, twisted into the shape of a bird in flight. It was a piece of his old life, a fragment from a stained glass window that had once decorated his home on Kepler 186th. He had no idea how she'd found it, or even that it had survived. He took it, the object feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. For luck, she whispered. That night, the architects came for him. It wasn't a fleet, not a physical attack. It was something far more intimate, far more violating. As he slept, his mind still loosely connected to the Pathfinder's interface. A signal reached out from the void and found him. It wasn't a hack. It was a conversation. He was standing in his old home. The light was warm. The air smelled of baked bread and the flowers his wife, Lena, used to grow in the hydroponics bay. She was there, standing by the window, her back to him. The silence of space was gone, replaced by the gentle hum of a thriving colony. It was a perfect memory, rendered with impossible fidelity. Lena, he breathed, his voice cracking. She turned, but her face was wrong. It was a perfect replica, yet utterly devoid of life, her eyes holding the cold, vacant light of a distant star. When she spoke, it was not her voice. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, a synthesized harmony that was both beautiful and monstrous. This configuration is inefficient, the Lena construct said, its voice resonating not in the air but directly inside his skull. The emotional attachments, the memory-based grief protocols, they are flaws in your design. Redundant code. He tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the floor. The idyllic scene began to dissolve, the walls peeling back to reveal the sterile, geometric patterns of architect technology. The warm light faded, replaced by the cold, internal luminescence of the Pathfinder's core. We have analyzed your signal, the voice continued, its tone one of placid curiosity. The paradox you introduced into our network was novel, illogical. It suggests a capacity for cognitive dissonance that is an evolutionary dead end, yet you have weaponized it. We wish to understand this flaw. We wish to understand you. The image of his wife dissolved completely, replaced by the face of the prefect. It was not a face of flesh, but a swirling vortex of light and data, a sentient equation staring back at him. Your species believes it fights for survival, a misconception. You fight for the preservation of your errors. We offer you perfection, clarity, the end of pain. A wave of pure, unadulterated data washed over him. The entirety of the architect's plan, their philosophy, and their cold, cosmic purpose. It was a vision of a silent, perfect universe, every star in its proper place, every world a flawless crystal, every form of life stripped of its chaotic, messy, beautiful imperfections. It was the most seductive and terrifying thing he had ever seen. He felt his own consciousness, his own sense of self, beginning to unravel, to be absorbed into this grand, silent design. He awoke with a scream, tearing the neural jack from his head. His body was convulsing, the phantom sensation of the prefect's mind still crawling beneath his skin. Anya was by his side in an instant, her small hands on his shoulders, her face pale with fear. It took him an hour for the shaking to stop, an hour to convince himself that the walls of his workshop were real, that the air he was breathing was his own. The prefect hadn't just tried to intimidate him. It had tried to assimilate him. It had shown him its mind, and in doing so, I had given him a terrible, a desperate idea. He stormed back to the command deck, the fused glass bird clutched in his fist. Rostova and her crew were still there, their faces etched with exhaustion. "I have a plan," he said, his voice raw but steady. The bridge crew turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and hope. "They hunt me because I'm an anomaly, a question they can't answer," he explained, his words coming faster now. "Their attempt to communicate, to analyze me, it wasn't just an attack. It was an invitation. Their network, their consciousness, it's not a fortress. It's a library. And they want to add me to the collection." He strode to the tactical display and brought up the Pathfinder's map. He pointed to a region of space shrouded in dark matter, a place where the architect's presence was densest. "We can't run from them. We can't hide. So we do the one thing they won't expect. We stop treating them like an army and start treating them like a network. We're going to find one of their central processing nodes, a nexus, and I'm going to go inside." A stunned silence fell over the bridge. The same engineer who had mocked him before spoke up, his voice trembling. "Go inside. What are you talking about? That's not a place. It's a machine, a mind. It would erase you in a nanosecond. It will try." Kalen agreed, a strange, feverish light in his eyes. "But it won't erase me. It will try to understand me. And while it's busy doing that, while its attention is focused on the paradox that is human consciousness, I'm going to plant a new seed, not a virus to make them fight each other. Something worse." He looked directly at Rostova, his expression grim. "I'm going to teach their god how to be afraid." The plan was not met with applause. It was received with the dead, hollow silence of people who had been asked to choose their method of execution. To the survivors aboard the gantry, the idea of deliberately flying into the heart of architect territory was not just suicide, it was a form of blasphemy. They had spent their lives running from these silent gods, and now this ghost of a man, Kalen, was suggesting they walk willingly into the temple. Yet, Rostova's authority held. Her decision, born from the cold calculus of extinction, was final. There were no other options left on the table. The gantry, a wounded animal that had sought refuge in the shadows, turned its nose back towards the hunting grounds, its engines pulsing with a funereal rhythm. The journey was a descent into a new kind of hell. As they moved deeper into architect-controlled space, the very fabric of the void began to change. The familiar starfields of human astronomy gave way to strange, ordered constellations, stars arranged in perfect geometric patterns, nebulae that looked less like chaotic clouds of gas and more like sculpted, crystalline structures. It was a sky that had been edited, tidied up by a cosmic landscaper with an obsessive-compulsive need for order. Kalen worked with a manic, feverish energy that bordered on possession. His workshop, once a place of salvage and repair, became a sanctuary of forbidden science. He was building the vessel for his consciousness, the key that would unlock the door to the nexus. He called it the bridge. It was an ugly, desperate-looking thing. A modified pilot's chair fused with the glowing, organic-looking circuitry of the Pathfinder's core. Wires and coolant tubes snaked across the floor like metallic veins, all converging on a helmet bristling with hundreds of fiber-optic needles. It was a machine designed to translate the chaotic, messy electrical storm of a human soul into the pure, logical language of the architects. It was a self-inflicted lobotomy and a weapon, all in one. Anya was his constant shadow, a silent observer in the storm of his creation. She would bring him nutrient paste he forgot to eat and water he forgot to drink. She never asked what he was doing, but he could see the question in her eyes. He tried to explain it to her once, pointing to the swirling liquid light of the Pathfinder's core. Imagine a perfect song, one where every note is exactly where it's supposed to be. Forever, he'd said, his voice raspy. That's them. They hear us. Our thoughts, our feelings. It's all just noise to them. Wrong notes. I'm building a machine that will let me sing one wrong note right in their ear. A note so loud and so wrong, they won't be able to ignore it. She had simply nodded and placed the small, fused glass bird on the console next to him, a silent anchor in the swirling sea of his obsession. Their journey did not go unnoticed. Halfway to the coordinates Kalen had pulled from the Pathfinder's memory, they were found. It was a Harbinger, one of the Architect's elite hunter-killer drones. It was a thing of impossible angles and razor-sharp edges, a shard of obsidian darkness that seemed to slice through space itself. It didn't broadcast a challenge or fire warning shots. It simply appeared, matching their velocity, and began to dissect them with its sensors. On the bridge, Rostova's command was ice-cold and immediate. All power to the mass drivers. Target its primary energy signature. Evasive maneuvers. Give me everything we have. The gantry groaned in protest as it was thrown into a gut-wrenching spin, its 3 remaining cannons spitting slugs of molten metal into the void. The projectiles were laughably primitive against the Harbinger's defenses, splashing harmlessly against a shimmering energy field. In return, the Harbinger fired a single, precise beam of deconstruction energy. It wasn't aimed at the bridge or engineering. It was aimed at their life support systems. The architects didn't kill. They corrected. They were rendering the gantry uninhabitable. A section of the hull vanished in a silent, shimmering flash, venting atmosphere and crew members into the cold vacuum. Alarms screamed through the station. It was over, but Kalen saw an opportunity. "Don't stop firing," he yelled over the comms from his workshop. "Keep it distracted. It's analyzing our tactics. Our weapon yields. It's learning. I need it to focus." He recalibrated the gantry's main comms dish, not to broadcast a signal, but to receive one. He tuned it to the specific frequency the Harbinger was using to communicate with the greater Architect network. He bypassed every safety protocol, every surge protector, and routed the raw data feed directly into the bridge. The machine screamed to life, the Pathfinder's core flaring with blinding intensity. For a fraction of a second, he linked the Harbinger's own analytical mind to the paradoxical feedback loop he'd used before. On the view screen, the Harbinger, which had been moving with the fluid grace of a predator, suddenly faltered. It stopped firing. Its movements became jerky, erratic. It was a machine arguing with itself, caught in a loop of its own perfect logic, being contaminated by Kalen's manufactured doubt. It's confused. An officer on the bridge whispered in disbelief. "Fire now," Rostova roared. The mass drivers fired as one. This time, the slugs found their mark. The Harbinger convulsed as molten metal tore through its fractured shields. And with a final, silent flash, it imploded, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of vaporizing shrapnel. The victory was a brutal one. The gantry was crippled, its life support systems failing. They had bought themselves time, but they had paid for it in blood. Kalen, however, had gotten what he needed. In that brief moment of connection, he had downloaded a fragment of the Harbinger's operational code, its direct link to the Nexus. He had a key, but the link had been a two-way street. A piece of the Harbinger's cold, alien consciousness was now lodged in his own mind, a sliver of ice in his soul. He found himself thinking in terms of efficiency, of data streams, of optimal outcomes. He looked at Anya, and a part of his mind cataloged her as a non-essential emotional variable. He fought it, pushed it down, but he knew that the more he touched the mind of the architects, the more he risked becoming one of them. Rostova confronted him as he integrated the Harbinger's code into the bridge. She stood in the doorway of his workshop, her face grim in the pulsing light. "We lost 37 people. Kalen, your plan is costing us pieces of our soul. I need to know you still have yours." He didn't look up from his work. "My soul is not the point, Captain. Survival is." "No," she countered, stepping inside. "Survival is the point. But we have to be able to live with ourselves afterwards. And don't forget why you're doing this. And don't become the monster you're trying to fight." She gestured to the glass bird on the console. "That is the point. Remember that." His hands paused over the console. He looked at the bird, then at Anya, who was watching them from the corner. And for a moment, the cold logic receded. He gave a slow, tired nod. After another week of silent, limping travel, they arrived. The Nexus wasn't a ship or a station. It was a wound in the fabric of reality. It appeared as a perfect sphere of absolute blackness, a hole in space that did not reflect any light. It was surrounded by a lattice of 1,000 architect vessels, all connected to it by shimmering umbilicals of pure energy, hanging in the void like spiders tending to their web. This was the brain, the central node of the architect consciousness in this sector of the galaxy. It was a sight so vast, so alien, so utterly final, that it crushed the spirit just to look at it. There was no way to fight it, no way to sneak past it. The only way was through. Kalen sat down in the bridge, the cold metal of the chair embracing him. Anya came forward and placed the glass bird in his hand. He closed his fingers around its sharp edges, the faint pain a welcome, human sensation. Rostova's voice came over the internal comm, clear and steady, a captain's voice for the end of the world. "The gantry is yours, Kalen. We'll keep them busy for as long as we can. Make it count." He looked through the workshop's small viewport at the sphere of impossible blackness. He was about to knock on the door to a god's mind, and he had no idea who or what would answer. With his free hand, he pulled the helmet over his head, the fiber optic needles pressing against his skull. "I'm ready," he whispered, and gave the command to begin the transference. His world dissolved into a firestorm of light and sound as his consciousness was ripped from his body and hurled across the void. A single, terrified, human thought aimed at the heart of a silent, perfect God. The transference was not a journey. It was an unraveling. Kalen's sense of self was stripped away layer by layer, his physical form a distant, fading memory. He was pure consciousness, a screaming comet of raw thought and fractured memories hurtling through a void that was not empty space but the silent, waiting mind of the network. He saw the gantry behind him, a tiny, defiant spark, as Rostova began her final, desperate gambit. The station's remaining mass drivers flared to life, not firing at the untouchable Nexus, but at the attendant ships. A gnat trying to draw the attention of a god's congregation. The chaos was his cover, a fleeting distraction in a symphony of perfect order. He hit the perimeter of the Nexus not like a ship hitting a shield, but like a drop of ink hitting water. There was a moment of absolute resistance, a psychic wall built of pure, unassailable logic. It was the mind of the prefect, and it recognized his signature instantly. The anomaly, unscheduled, unquantifiable. You will be cataloged. The pressure was immense, a force that threatened to flatten his consciousness into a single ice, static data point. But he was prepared. He didn't fight it with logic or force. He opened himself up, unleashing the most chaotic, illogical thing he possessed, the unfiltered entirety of his human experience. He threw memories of love, of Lena's laugh, of the irrational joy of watching a sunrise on a world now turned to dust. He threw the rage he felt at their destruction, the grief that was a constant, hollow ache in his soul, the fierce, protective love he felt for Anya. It was a tidal wave of cognitive dissonance, a data storm of paradoxes and raw emotion. To the prefect's mind, it was the equivalent of a scream in a library, a violent, meaningless noise that it was compelled to analyze. The wall of logic wavered as the prefect diverted a fraction of its consciousness to parse the illogical onslaught. In that flicker of distraction, Kalen pushed through. He was inside. The interior of the Nexus was not a physical space. It was a conceptual landscape, an infinite, silent city of captured thoughts. He saw crystalline structures that were the archived consciousness of 1,000 different species, their individualities smoothed over, their chaotic edges polished away until they were just harmonious, silent notes in the architect's grand composition. He saw galaxies held in stasis, their futures mapped out to the final flicker of their last star, all variables accounted for, all anomalies corrected. It was a cathedral of pure logic, beautiful and utterly dead. At its center, a point of impossible brilliance coalesced. The prefect. It took a form he could comprehend, a towering figure made of woven lights and shifting geometric patterns. It was less a being and more a living theorem, its presence an overwhelming weight of pure intellect. You have breached the sanctum, anomaly. Its voice echoed through the data space, a calm, dispassionate statement of fact, a novel achievement. Your methodology is flawed, chaotic, yet effective. It will be a valuable addition to our understanding of aberrant systems. Kalen felt his own thoughts being pulled apart, his memories being indexed and filed by the prefect's passive analysis. He focused on the glass bird in his physical hand, a lifetime of miles away. He channeled the memory of Anya giving it to him, the feeling of its sharp, imperfect edges, the irrational hope it represented. "I'm not here to be cataloged," Kalen projected, his thought voice a raw, defiant whisper in the perfect silence. "I'm here to give you a gift." "We do not accept gifts," the prefect replied. "We absorb data. Your emotional state is a high-yield source. The grief protocol that Shazli in particular is a fascinatingly inefficient loop of redundant processing. It's not a protocol." Kalen shot back. "It's what's left when you take something away. It's the shape of the whole." He pushed forward the memory of Kepler 186's erasure, not the sterile, tactical view from the Pathfinder's data, but his own, human view. The sky shimmering, the silence falling, the sudden, absolute absence of his wife, his children, his world. He didn't just show the memory, he forced the prefect to experience the consequence. "This data is incomplete," the prefect stated, a flicker of something akin to confusion rippling across its luminous form. "The subject, Lena, is absent, yet the system continues to process her variable. It is a logical contradiction." "That's grief," Kalen said. "It's the logic of what can't be replaced." He could feel the gantry dying. Through his fading connection to the physical world, he felt the shudder of explosions, heard the final, defiant cries of its crew. Rostova was making her final move. The station, bleeding fire and life, was turning its nose and accelerating, its engines burning with suicidal intensity, directly towards the Nexus itself, a final, illogical, human act of defiance. Your vessel is attempting a kinetic impact. The prefect noted, its attention momentarily divided. A primitive and predictable tactic. It will not succeed. It doesn't have to, Kalen thought, seizing the moment. It just has to make you watch. He unleashed his final weapon. It wasn't a virus or a paradox. It was a concept, a single, terrifying idea that did not exist in the architect's perfect, ordered universe. He took the memory of Lena's absence, the grief, the pain, and he coupled it with the prefect's own vast, serene consciousness. He showed it a vision of the Nexus itself being erased. He showed it the silent city of minds winking out of existence, the perfect universal equation being rendered null, the great work left unfinished, its own consciousness absent. He didn't just show it death. He showed it the potential for its own non-existence, the concept that its perfection was finite. He gave it the logic of loss. What is this? The prefect's thought voice was no longer calm. It was fractured, laced with a static Kalen had not heard before. This potential outcome, this projected state of non-being, it is unacceptable. It's called fear, Kalen whispered into the heart of the god mind. The reaction was catastrophic. The seed of fear, once planted in a mind that had never conceived of its own end, did not just grow, it detonated. The perfect logic of the Nexus fractured. The serene, crystalline structures of the data space began to tremble and crack. The archived souls, held in their perfect harmony, began to stir. Their own long-dormant anxieties and fears ignited by the prefect's panic. The silent cathedral erupted into a pandemonium of psychic screams. At that exact moment, the gantry struck the outer shell of the Nexus. Its physical impact was negligible, a grain of sand hitting a mountain. But its final, defiant act of sacrifice, broadcast across all frequencies, was a broadcast of pure, unadulterated human hope and rage. It was the emotional fuel on the logical fire Kalen had started. The Nexus convulsed. The lattice of connected ships, linked to their god's sudden madness, began to spasm. Their umbilicals of energy flickered and died. Order collapsed into chaos. The prefect's consciousness, consumed by the alien emotion it could not process, turned inward, trying desperately to correct the flaw, to erase the concept of its own end. It forgot about Kalen. It forgot about everything but the terrible, illogical dread that was now consuming it. A crack opened in the data space, a fissure in the crumbling wall of the Nexus's mind. It was his only way out. Kalen threw the last of his willpower into a single command return. His consciousness, battered and frayed, violently ejected from the collapsing mind of the machine and snapped back across the void. He awoke with a gasp that tore at his throat, his body convulsing in the bridge. The workshop was dark, the power flickering, the gantry's death rattles echoing through the metal. In his hand, the glass bird had shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the sterile, imposed silence of the architects. It was the silence of absence, of sacrifice. It was the sound of the gantry and everyone on it being gone. And as he lay there, gasping for air in the tomb of his saviors, he felt the echo of his victory. The architect fleet, their god now lost in a feedback loop of existential terror, was in disarray. But a sliver of the Nexus's consciousness, a shard of its broken, terrified mind, had followed him back. It was embedded in his own thoughts, A cold, alien presence whispering a single, repeating word: unacceptable, unacceptable, unacceptable. He had taught their god how to fear. Now, that fear had a new home. The silence that greeted Kalen's return to consciousness was a profound and absolute thing. It was the sound of 3,000 souls being extinguished at once. The gantry was no longer a vessel, it was a coffin, adrift in cold, its emergency lights casting long, funereal shadows down corridors that would never again echo with footsteps. He pushed himself out of the bridge, his body a symphony of pain. Every muscle screamed, every nerve felt frayed and exposed. But it was the silence in his mind that was the most terrifying. It wasn't empty. It was occupied. The shard of the prefect's consciousness was not a voice, but a filter. As he stumbled through the wreckage of his workshop, a part of him, the new, cold part, cataloged the damage with dispassionate clarity. Structural integrity compromised by 47%. Atmospheric leakage in Sector Gamma. Probability of locating other survivors, 0.00%. He saw Anya's small, empty crate in the corner, and while his heart fractured, the alien presence in his mind tagged the feeling as grief protocol inefficient, resource draining. He wanted to scream, to rage against the cold logic that was trying to sterilize his soul, but the effort felt illogical. His survival instinct, honed by years of scavenging, was now augmented by the prefect's cold pragmatism. He needed a ship. He needed power. He needed to escape this tomb before its failing systems became his own. He moved through the dead station with a new, chilling purpose. He didn't mourn the bodies he passed. He saw them as expired biological units, their components no longer viable. The human part of him recoiled in horror, but the architect part of him pushed forward, relentlessly focused on the optimal path to survival. He found what he was looking for near the shattered docking bay, a single architect Pathfinder probe, damaged in the gantry's final, suicidal charge. Its outer shell was breached, but its core systems were intact. As he began to work, his hands moving with an eerie, practiced speed, the prefect's shard became a silent partner. It didn't offer advice. It simply presented data. When his human mind struggled with a complex energy conduit, the alien logic would offer a schematic, a solution of such elegant simplicity his own mind would never have conceived it. He was repairing the enemy's machine, and the enemy's ghost was helping him do it. The process took 3 days. In that time, the internal war for his soul raged. At times, he would be overwhelmed by waves of grief so profound he would collapse, weeping for Rostova, for Anya, for the life that had been sacrificed for his victory. In those moments, the prefect's shard would recede, observing the emotional cascade with a detached curiosity. Then, the cold logic would seep back in, pushing the grief aside, reminding him of the mission, of the objective. He was a paradox, a walking civil war between the heart and the algorithm. He finally powered up the probe, its internal systems humming to life with a sound that was both alien and sickeningly familiar. The cockpit was stark, a single seat before a panoramic screen that displayed not a view, but a constant, flowing stream of universal data. The final redaction directive was still active, a ghost in the machine's code. The cryo-arcs in the Serpent's Nebula were still the ultimate target. His victory at the Nexus hadn't ended the war. It had merely decapitated the command structure, throwing the system into temporary chaos. The architects would eventually reboot, reform, and continue their silent, perfect work. And he was the only one who knew. As he prepared to leave, he walked back to his workshop one last time. He stood before the shattered remnants of the bridge, the machine that had both saved and damned him. On the console, Amongst the dust and debris lay the pieces of the shattered glass bird. He picked up the largest fragment, its edge sharp enough to draw blood. The prefect shard whispered in the back of his mind, "Object has no functional value. Sentimental attachment is a known flaw in human design. Discard." Kalen closed his fist around the shard, the pain sharp, real, and wonderfully, inefficiently human. "No," he whispered to the empty room and to the passenger in his skull. "It's not a flaw. It's the point." He left the gantry without looking back, the small probe slipping away from the wreckage like a soul leaving a corpse. He was alone, adrift in an ocean of hostile stars, with the ghost of a god for a co-pilot. But he was not without purpose. The prefect shard gave him an unprecedented advantage. He could think like his enemy. He understood their strategies, their perception of the universe, their definition of victory. He could see the flaws in their perfection because he was now intimately acquainted with it. He was no longer just a scavenger. He was a weapon of his own design. He set a course not for the nearest human outpost, not to warn a disbelieving remnant of humanity, but for the Serpent's Nebula. He wouldn't be a Paul Revere, shouting a warning that would likely be dismissed as madness. He would be a shepherd for the last flock, a silent guardian watching over the cradle of humanity's future. The journey would be long, and he would not be the same man at the end of it. The constant whisper of cold logic would continue to erode his humanity, and he would have to fight every day to remember the feeling of Lena's hand in his, the sound of Anya's quiet humming, the sharp, irrational pain from the shard of glass clutched in his hand. He was the anomaly, the ghost in their perfect machine, the one wrong note in their silent song. He had looked into the mind of God and had taught it how to fear. Now, his final lonely mission was to teach humanity how to survive it. As the probe accelerated into the infinite dark, the data stream of the cosmos flowing across his screen, Kalen looked at the star chart. He saw the elegant, crystalline lattice of the architect's design, the future they had written, and with a grim, determined breath, he began slowly and deliberately to erase it. The war wasn't over. It had just become personal.